In 1986, Don Mcreery and Wendy Ofredo, who were 20 and 21 at the time, had come to the end of their shift as two young waitresses. They decided it was time to head home. So they get into Wendy Ofredo's 1971 Datsun 1600 and began driving on Interstate 77. The car was filled with joy, laughter, and overall good energy. As they approached the Stoner Street Bridge on Interstate 77, Wendy's car was suddenly struck by a massive concrete object. This massive object landed on Wendy's front hood and immediately disabled her engine. She pulled over to the side of the road to make way for passing traffic as her car came to a halt. To assess the situation, Dawn and Wendy stepped out of the car and began making their way to the front of the car. The two young women were amazed to see that the large object that had struck their vehicle was a huge concrete block. Dawn, terrified and physically shaking, decides that she would give her older brother a call to come and assist her. While searching for her cell phone, three young men approached the car and told the girls that they had seen the whole accident and they wanted to check if they were okay. Seeing the desperation in Dawn's face as she frantically searched the car, one of the boys asked Dawn what she was looking for. Dawn responded, "My phone. I can't find it." One of the boys then offered to drive the girls to a nearby shopping center where they would be able to make a phone call. Feeling stranded and out of options, the girls left their vehicle and got into the car with the young boys. They didn't know it yet, but this would be the biggest mistake they would ever make. August 31st, 1986. 19-year-old Richard Cooey had just returned on leave from the U.S. Army. Bored, Richard decides to call up his old friends Kenneth Horonitz and Clinton Dickinson since they hadn't seen each other in a while. The group then makes a decision that they would meet up at 3 p.m. at Clinton's house and hang out. Right around 2:30 p.m., Richard gets into his mom's car and makes his way to pick up Kenneth as they had agreed. The pair then made a stop at a gas station to pick up a few snacks before continuing their journey to Clinton's house. What the trio did at Clinton's house is still unclear, but what we do know is that the group spent about 3.5 hours at Clinton's house. At some point, the trio left Clinton's house and began driving around in the city. When the trio drove past the Stoner Street Bridge, Clinton had an idea. He proposed the idea of throwing large concrete blocks onto 18-wheeler trucks passing below the bridge as a prank. But for now, let's forget about Clinton and his friends, because 25 minutes away, two young waitresses end their shifts and begin driving home to finally end their day and prepare for the next day. The night seems like every other night. The car was filled with jokes, laughter, and conversation, when all of a sudden, a loud bang was heard in front of the car. The windshield shattered, and glass debris flew everywhere. Immediately, Wendy's car lost power. She used the remaining momentum to pull the car over to the side of the road, before assessing the source of the deafening sound. The young women exited the car and made their way to the front before assessing the damage caused by the large object. Shockwaves tore through the young females' bodies when they realized how close they were to being seriously injured, or even worse. Dawn, visibly shaken, decided to head back to the car to retrieve her phone and call a family member to come and assist her and take her home. While Dawn frantically searched for her phone, 3 teenagers approached the young females and asked them if they were okay. Dawn told the young boys that they were fine, but she couldn't find her phone. In this moment, the valuable jewelry worn by Dawn caught Richard's attention. Richard turned around and tapped Clinton's shoulder, pointing at Dawn. And without saying a word, the young boys looked at each other and nodded in unison. This nod was one of sinister intentions, and one that would lead them to make a decision they would all regret for the rest of their lives. Richard told the girls that he could drive them to a nearby shopping center where they would be able to make a phone call. Feeling stranded and out of options, the girls left their vehicle and got into the car with the young boys. Richard drove the group to a shopping center where Dawn used a payphone to call her mother and inform her about the accident. While Dawn and Wendy were distracted on the payphone, Richard turned to Clinton and said, "I'm game if you're game," suggesting that they rob the two women. The group quickly got back to the car and began discussing the details of their sudden plan. Richard told his friends that when the girls got back in the car, instead of taking them back to the scene of the accident, he's gonna drive them to a deserted location where he'll pull out a pocket knife, then rob the girls of their expensive jewelry. At first, Kenneth went along with Richard's plan, thinking it was a joke. And when Dawn and Wendy re-entered the car, Richard drove the girls to a deserted location in Ohio. Richard then pulled out a knife and instructed the girls to exit the car. Once outside, Richard handed Kenneth a rope and asked him to tie Dawn Mcreery's hands. Kenneth got cold feet and refused to take the rope from Richard, immediately asking to be excused from the scene. Where Kenneth went is still a mystery, but what we do know is that this was the best decision he could have made, as it saved him from the same fate that would later be faced by his friends. After Kenneth's departure, Richard and Clinton forced the girls back into the car and drove to a wooded area nearby Norton. Here, Richard and Clinton would force themselves onto the terrified and helpless women. They then subjected the women to more than 3 hours of brutal beatings. During the assault, Richard would make a critical mistake. Instead of referring to Clinton with his code name, Richard would slip up and address Clinton with his real name. This major slip-up by Richard made Clinton to panic, since he knew that the women could now identify him. Clinton then suggested that the women be killed, since leaving them alive drastically increased the chances of them being caught and going to jail. Clinton then grabbed Dawn in a chokehold, while Richard used a shoelace to choke Dawn until she passed out. They then did the exact same thing to Wendy, who tried fiercely to fight back, but unfortunately, due to the hours upon hours of torture that she endured, coupled with the two men, meant that she was outnumbered, outpowered, and too powerless to fight back. Richard then picked up a golf club and repeatedly beat the women's corpses before stabbing Dawn's lifeless body in the neck. Clinton went back to strangle Dawn to ensure that she was dead, and once he was sure, the pair undressed the two women of their jewelry and dragged their lifeless bodies into the nearby woods. In an attempt to cover up their tracks, Richard and Clinton used leaf trees to brush off the car's tire marks before leaving the women's dead bodies to decompose and rot away. They also used this time to wash their clothes, themselves, and discard the victims' purses before heading home. The women's dead bodies were discovered by a local farmer the next day who was out on his daily walk. The farmer alerted the authorities, who arrived on the scene shortly after. It wasn't long until Wendy's damaged car was discovered a few miles from where the women's corpses had been found. The items found in the car were not publicly disclosed, but we do know that Wendy's car was found with both doors closed, but unlocked. Police contacted the victims' families and asked them to come and identify the victims' bodies. The families were then asked to take a look at the items believed to belong to the victims. This was when the victims' families realized that the victims' jewelry was missing. Wendy and Dawn were known to be heavy jewelry collectors and had quite an extensive jewelry collection. They never left the house without wearing some sort of jewelry. So when none of their jewelry pieces was among the items presented by the police then put out a warning to all jewelry dealers in the area to be on the lookout for the specific pieces of jewelry described by the victims' family members. A few days after the murders, an informant called the police, stating that Richard was trying to sell jewelry belonging to the victims. The next day, Richard found out that the police had discovered the bodies and had already begun investigating. In a panic, Richard sent Clinton, Kenneth, and another friend named Terry Grant went back to where they had discarded the victims' purses and recovered them. The trio then took the purses to Richard's house, where they set them on fire. The informant who gave police the tip earlier also gave police Richard's address. Police then set up surveillance while they obtained the warrants needed to arrest Richard and another one to search his house. A few hours into the operation, Richard was spotted leaving his house with a bag, but since the officers had already obtained the warrants they needed, they moved in to arrest Richard. Richard was found with some of the stolen jewelry in the backpack he was carrying. More of the stolen jewelry was found in his grandmother's car, leading police to suspect that Richard had already found a buyer for some of the stolen jewelry. The police then searched his house and found more items that they took and kept as evidence. At the police station, Richard immediately began giving the police a statement and confessed to killing the two young women. Richard also admitted everyone's role in the double murders and stated that Kenneth had left the scene before this tragedy had taken place. Clinton, Kenneth, and Terry were soon arrested and brought in for questioning. After everybody's statement was taken, Terry was set free as his involvement in the crime was seen as minor. Kenneth was also set free because he had left the scene before the tragedy took place. Clinton was sentenced to life in prison since he was only 17 at the time. Richard was sentenced to death for the double murder of Don Mcreery and Wendy Ofredo, since robbing the two women was all his plan. Due to human error and new evidence constantly emerging, Richard's execution was postponed until 2008. Richard tried multiple times over the years to get his sentence reduced and to get the death penalty taken away, but all of his requests were ultimately denied. In 2002, Richard asserted that the manifest weight of the evidence is insufficient to support his conviction on the murder with prior calculation or design counts. Cooey contends that the evidence shows that the decision to kill the victims was instantaneous, rather than with thought and preparation. A reviewing court will not reverse a verdict where there is substantial evidence upon which the trier of fact could reasonably conclude that all of the elements of an offense have been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Here, there is substantial evidence that Cooey and the co-defendant discussed and formulated a plan to kill the victims, where evidence adduced at trial reveals the presence of sufficient time and opportunity for the planning of a murder to constitute prior calculation, and the circumstances surrounding the murder show a scheme designed to implement the calculated decision to kill. A finding of prior calculation and design is justified. Despite all his efforts, Richard was executed by lethal injection in 2008